Nicholas, great to have you here. Before we get rolling, I just wanted to share a quick story relating to today's topic. So I had this friend and they were really into stones and crystals and things like that. And they would even take me out to go stone hunting with them. But unfortunately, after some time, I had to back away from our friendship. I had to kind of cancel it because I felt like they were taking me for granite.
Oh, there's one I've never heard before.
Granite. Taking me for granite. Oh my God, everybody. That was an awful joke, a terrible joke. It's been a couple of months since I've told a really awful joke. So I'm super glad that I was able to get that one out. Hey, everybody. Welcome to What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor. And oh my goodness, this show has been a long time coming. I have probably had more requests to do this show than I have maybe any other thing, probably Aleister Crowley and John Dee, but this is a strong third place sitting. And a lot of people are like, Doug, when are you going to take New Age crystals down a peg? You're always taking things down a peg. And truthfully, it's one of those things where it's like, slide out of the saddle. I had a dad who was a geologist. I grew around with rocks all over my house. My dad would literally be driving. We'd be on a road trip and he would pull the car over and make us get out of the vehicle to look at rock formations along the Rocky Mountain. He would explain everything. So rocks and gems and crystals and things of this nature have been a part of my life for my entire life. And I really wanted to get somebody on the show who knows about these things to talk about this. I'm not going to say controversial, but it definitely elicits a lot of people's opinions. And so today we're going to be talking about stones, gems, and crystals. And I have the perfect guest who has been immersed in all aspects of the mineral kingdom for nearly 30 years. He is one of the leading voices in crystal healing today, as he has a unique blend of science and spirituality alongside a grounded, practical approach to working with crystals, all of which he weaves into the books he's authored and the classes he offers. When I found out that the word luminous is a part of his moniker, well, I knew I had to have him on the show to talk about stones, gems, and crystals. Nicholas Pearson, the Luminous Pearl Nicholas. Welcome to What Magic Is This?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. And as I've said, stones, gems, and crystals is one of those things where everybody who has even a toe in magic has an opinion on them. Some people are like, it's all garbage. Some people are like, I was miraculously healed. I believe everything. Quartz can do this. I've experienced all of it. And I wanted to get somebody who has, I've just used the metaphor, I'll use it again, who has 1 foot perhaps in the science and 1 foot in the spiritual. And so I really want to get to the basics of this thing that we can call the bones of the earth. So before we get rock and roll in here, is there anything that you'd like the listeners to keep in their heads as we make our way through this topic?
I think maybe a good place to get started is just a little bit of nomenclature. I'm a stickler for words. I think even if I didn't use words professionally as a writer, I'd still be a stickler for words. I'm just that guy. And I'm going to preface this by saying, like, the International Mineralogical Association is not going to knock on anybody's doors for using these terms interchangeably in colloquial speech. It's cool. We all do it. But to really understand what we're talking about, we have to look at what they're made out of. So when we talk about words like a crystal implies a really regular, repeatable, maybe rhythmic kind of structure that we call a crystal lattice. Crystals are defined as usually solid substances that have a regular composition. In other words, it's always the same ingredients. There's a little wiggle room there, but we'll save that for later. And then they have this repeating and symmetrical structure, which has this hallmark that we might term periodicity in the way it repeats, or coherence in the fact that it is so regular. Minerals are just inorganic, naturally occurring crystals. So we have that regular composition, repeating symmetrical structure. Mother Nature made it without our influence, and it's made by inorganic processes, then we call it a mineral. So, lots of things that we think of as crystals in the colloquial sense are, definitely classified as minerals. Hematite, calcite, fluorite, quartz, you name it, it's probably there. But then we get to this place where minerals aggregate, where they come together. We can have really complex blends of things. We can have really, really simple blends of things. And these are what we call rocks. So limestone, quartzite, amphibolite, schist, granite. These are all, yeah, of course. And some of those, like quartzite is almost pure quartz. In some cases, it's very, very, very nearly pure quartz. Sandstone. One of my favorite rocks from Great Britain is something called sarsen. It's a type of highly silicified sandstone. It's 97% pure quartz. So it's pretty much up there, but it's still an aggregate rather than a single structure. So we're going to consider it a rock. There are some things we think of as crystals or gems that are really rocks. Lapis lazuli, metamorphic rock. It used to be limestone, and then it got squished and bent and twisted, and other things happened to it. And now we get this beautiful mass of, bright ultramarine blue with flecks of gold and swirls of white. So still technically a rock. Then we get things that don't neatly fit into these categories. We can think of opal, obsidian, the family of tektites, which are natural glasses, and then things of organic origin like amber and pearl and jet. These are what we call mineraloids. They're almost minerals. They're not quite there. They fail to meet one or more of the criteria. We can also expand our scope and think about those 4 criteria: the composition being regular, the structure being repeating and symmetrical, natural in origin, and inorganic. So, the calcium phosphate in our bones is more or less identical to the apatite you're going to go find in the earth, but our body's made it. Mineraloid,
right?
Not mineral. Ice that's in your freezer, mineraloid. When it falls from the sky or forms in a glacier, mineral. Ice is actually the most common mineral on the surface of the earth. We have to have the right preposition there. It has to be on.
Right.
Or we open ourselves up for more debate. So knowing all of these things matters for a couple of reasons. One, credibility. If we use the right terms, then we actually sound like we know what we're talking about. And I'd love for people to know what they're talking about. And 2, there's some implications, and I'm sure we're going to get into more of this exposition a little later. But if we think about the level of order and organization in a single crystal lattice, a single mineral, if you will, versus the composition of voices that we might get in a rock, something like granite, which is predominantly defined as having 3 main constituents: some kind of feldspar, quartz, and various micas. It could be biotite, could be muscite, could be other things. And then depending on where that granite comes from, you could have 2 or 3 accessory minerals. You could have 20 or 30 accessory minerals, depending on how big that sample set is. But it's like having an ensemble versus a solo voice or instrument. One is not inherently better than the other. They just do different things. So if we know the difference between a rock and a mineral, if we know how crystallinity fits into this, it can kind of give us an idea of what something's going to feel like in an esoteric manner. So I like to start with that kind of stuff first, because I think it primes the pump for the rest of our conversation.
100%. And I hope people listening now are like, holy shit, Nick knows what he is talking about. And that's perfect. And if you read any of Nick's books, you will understand that, yes, Nick has had this journey. And so I would like to ask a personal question, but how did stones, gems, crystals, minerals, rocks become such a huge part of your life, Nick?
So I was the stereotype. Little Nicholas went and picked up rocks everywhere he went. Really exotic locations, trips to the beach, family vacations to the mountains, the weekly trip to the grocery store. It didn't matter if I found a rock somewhere. If it spoke to me, it came home with me. Part of me laments the loss of this collection of random rocks. Part of me is also really grateful I haven't had to lug them everywhere for the past 30 or so years.
Right.
But by the time I turned 8, my grandfather gave me my first specimen of quartz, and all of a sudden this somewhat ordinary, inert part of the landscape, which I loved regardless, was transfigured into something luminous and angular and prismatic and magical. And it felt like I was holding something out of a storybook. You read fairy tales that involve sacred gems and holy stones and other kinds of materia magica, and I had quite a love for folklore, fairy tale, world religion, mythology, you name it. I was there. I didn't grow up in a religious household. My father was raised really Catholic,
Okay.
So I wasn't raised anything.
Right. That's how that happens.
Right. Yeah. Like he'd had enough of it to last several generations. So
Right.
we did library on weekends when other families did church. And I,
Cool.
for most of my life, still did not really comprehend what happened at church, but I knew my way around a library really well. And after getting that first piece of quartz, I had to know everything there was to know about rocks and minerals, from every angle. So, one week it might have been, earth science. Obviously, it was age appropriate stuff for as long as that was sustainable, because I burned through it all and we had to like go up to higher and higher reading levels. And then the following week, it might be folklore and fairy tale, anything I could sink my teeth into. And to my credit, I suppose I had no difficulty reconciling the difference in these perspectives. I always thought of them as fundamentally doing the same thing, and it is humans trying to make sense of the world around them. We can do that qualitatively, through metaphor and symbol and myth. We can do that quantitatively, measure data, study the chemistry of things, their formative processes, but ultimately, it's making sense of what's happening around us. And I really didn't understand how people could get locked into a single symbol set, a single book, a single means of interpreting said book as well. So yeah, I have to really credit my dad's science background as well as his desire to let me just be a kid, without the extra indoctrination. That definitely made a difference.
It's so interesting to me because a lot of people that I know who are really into stones and crystals and gems, they all seem to have the same story that at some point they were gifted. Is this idea of being gifted something that locks them in? And I think that's such an incredible thing. And you're talking my language, Nicholas, about different levels of understanding. That is what this show is about. Another reason that a lot of people come to my show is for the history. So, to your mind, what is the history of using stones, gems, and crystals for magical and mystical purposes? Has it just been something for as soon as we got opposable thumbs and we're picking stuff up, we have loved these things? What is the history of this kind of thing?
Wow, there is a lot. We certainly couldn't do it justice, but we often in metaphysical spaces love to cite the use of gems in places like Egypt and India. We love to look to, the late Neolithic when we talk about standing stones and other stone monuments in parts of Western Europe and elsewhere in the world. But the truth is that our relationship, well, all things rock and mineral, goes back way longer, way longer. So I think it was about 2020, maybe 2021. There was a paper published on a discovery in the Kalahari Desert where a stone shelter yielded a collection of rhombic bits of calcite, these natural kind of cleavage planes, normal crystal forms that clearly didn't come from that tiny little stone shelter, red cave.
Right.
But were amassed there, and there was evidence of them having been used in some sort of religious or spiritual purpose. Of course, we can't reconstruct what that was. They didn't leave instructions. I think this was like more than 20,000 years ago. It's estimated they were used. So this is quite a long time ago. Earlier than that, we have evidence of us partnering with rock and mineral that is truly mind-bogglingly ancient. There is a discovery that is popularly known as the Peking Man, and found outside of what is now modern day Beijing. We Romanize those words today. And this individual was Homo erectus, was not Homo sapiens. And they were buried with a collection, dozens, of quartz points, none of which endemic to the land in which those remains were buried, carefully packaged to be taken to the afterlife. And the age estimate on this varies quite a lot. It's a wide window, anywhere from like 250 to 450,000 years old.
Wow.
But to think about a hominid collecting crystals and being buried with them, taking them to the afterlife, almost 500,000 years ago, blows my mind. And we have evidence of stuff all through the ages, from the most ancient through the most recent. And there have been magical traditions that are well attested since the beginning of writing. some of the earliest texts that we have in cuneiform from places like Sumer, Babylon, Mesopotamia are actually lapidary texts, and they tend to be part inventory, part economic text describing trade routes, value, origin, but the medicinal and magical uses are also included in these things. So we see the mundane, the mythic, the curative all combined. There's no separation between them. And this is some of the earliest writing we've got. There's a text called the Abnu Shikinshu, which more or less translates to the stone whose appearance is ... And every entry begins Abnu Shikinshu and then describes the stone. And of course, we have no idea what these rocks are today for the most part, because the names they used back then don't have a traceable origin to modern languages. And our traits that we use to identify rocks and minerals look very different than those of our antecedents. So we just kind of have to take some educated guesses there. But this is older than writing. This is older than civilization. This is older than Homo sapiens. So
right.
It's primordial.
It's been with us forever. Just a word that you used, we don't need to spend a long time on it, but it's something that people will come across if they start becoming interested in this topic. But what is a lapidary?
Oh, good point. So the word lapidary comes to us from Greek lapis, meaning stone. And there is a tradition of, we'll say, writing style, text style called a lapidary that is a manual of stones. We use lapidary today more commonly as an adjective to describe arts made with stone. So like a lapidary artist is someone who facets gems or carves stone or does other kind of decorative things. But the lapidary tradition, when we talk about the literary tradition, is the kind of dissemination of information about crystals, rocks, gemstones, minerals through the written word. And initially, these made no distinction between natural history, the prototype of science, the prototype of geology, and the alchemical and magical and medicinal values of them. And by the time we get to the medieval period, there's this proliferation of lapidary texts, some of which are highly skeptical. People like Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus, who did a great job of preserving the folklore that he was staunchly trying to disprove.
Right.
So thankfully, he's one of the great occult authors, even though he's not an occultist. But we have quite a good preservation of these lapidary texts that persist into the modern day, and we can think of literature like I write, Crystal Basics, Seven Archetypal Stones, Crystalline Flower, as part of this greater lineage of work. I'm building mine upon generations that came before me that stretch all the way back to the beginning of writing, and that is truly humbling.
Yeah.
And it also kind of makes sure that I want to do a good job because I got to keep the trajectory rising upwards, right?
Right, exactly. Are there any places or periods of history in which stones, gems, and crystals were valued in interesting or amazing ways that really stand out? Is there like one period of time? You talked about Egypt. I also know the Babylonians really, but is there? It could even be the medieval ages because they love gems and stones. Is there a period of time that you're like, man, they really did stones good there?
Oh, it is so hard because
I'm sorry.
I think it's a constant throughout human history.
Yeah.
Whether we're looking at them as materia magica, as tools we use in spiritual practice, whether we're looking around the space in the modern era as building materials. I mean, anything in the room around you, if it wasn't grown, if it didn't come from a botanical or animal source, then it came from a mineral source. So, the cinder blocks that these walls are made out of, the pigments in the paint, like everything. So I think if I were going to settle on a period that I would find the most fascinating, I would probably pick after the age of the rationalism, after that kind of Renaissance, when we started to apply scientific or science-like thinking. It wasn't a really fully formed science. Geology is one of the youngest sciences practiced today. But this place where people were trying to figure out what made rocks tick in a new way. That's probably where I think I'm the most fascinated, because there was a really strong strain of what we call lapidary medicine, the use of gems medicinally, in this time period up into the early modern period. They were a part of the standard pharmacopoeia in any pharmacist's guild. But we also had this nascent birth of geology as a discipline that was beginning to, aggregate like a rock, and continues to grow to this day. So I think I'd really love that period where they were really coexisting rather peacefully.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've always been a sucker for lapidaries. That there's these weird symbols that seem to be found all over Northern Africa and Europe. And a good example of these is called the Abraxas stones. Have you ever heard of these things? Like they're just, people are saying that they're like, they're Gnostic. They have that god Abraxas on them usually, and Iao. They're very odd. And for people listening who really like the Gnostics and kind of strange symbols, you have to know about the Abraxas stones. I just find them incredibly fascinating. We have no idea why they were as popular, but they're across museums all over the world. We've just found so many of them. I'd like those when there's these weird artifacts that seem to last for a period of time and we don't really know where they come from or why they're being crafted, but we just know that they're a lot of them are being crafted. Those are always the most interesting to me, I've always found. Do you like those kind of things as well?
I do. So those fall into a category of materials that we call magical gems, which as generic as it sounds, magical gems refer to a very specific kind of non-Olympian strain of religious practice and philosophy that dates back to that kind of classical Greco-Roman period. But what's so fascinating about these magical gems is how persistent they are. People continued to use the same objects when they were a century old, 2 centuries old, 10 centuries old, and continued to make copies of them, continued to innovate, continued to blend their native thought and symbols into them. So in the last maybe 15 years, there's been some pretty decent scholarship on these as well. So we're seeing more anthologies and papers published. Sadly, they're published as textbooks, so they're not as accessible to mere mortals as we would like.
Right.
But I'm hoping to get my hands on as many as possible and be able to, extrapolate and synthesize from that so I can put it out at a more accessible way.
Definitely. And I'll have a link in the show notes for people of the Abraxas stones, but also a couple of online collections. You can look at some of these things and they're really quite, they're incredibly fascinating. I'm sorry to ask this question, Nicholas, but it's kind of in the same vein as the question I asked before, but are there any historical figures who stand out to you as promulgating the awesomeness of stones, gems, and crystals in a way that you can really get behind?
Yeah, there are a few. So the ones I probably relate to the most are fairly recent.
Okay.
But let's pull a couple not so recent ones as well. So let's start with the mystic of the Rhine, Hildegard of Bingen.
Yes.
She, in her Physica, in her medical text, she has a chapter on stones and a separate chapter on metals, and together they kind of comprise our geopharmaceuticals. And I love that right out of the gate, she comes in weird.
Yes.
She tells us that all stones have the kind of nature of fire and moisture within them, and it is the combination, the confluence, if you will, of these kind of elemental or maybe metaphorical forces that is responsible for their formation, and that very specifically the figure of Satan doesn't like gemstones because when he was still in heaven, he was, just cloaked in them. And so they remind him of his fall from grace. And that specifically is why gems have a curative power, because they keep the will of Satan at bay, because they remind him of his glory days, and he doesn't want any part of that. And God specifically sent them to earth, sent these gems to us to conquer this kind of evil force in our lives. So
love it.
Yeah, it's great. I think there's a lot of poetry there. There's a lot we can understand about her perspectives on health and healing and sickness and religion, and how it is very, outside the normal curriculum of what was sanctioned in religious institutions. And yet she was the head of a religious institution.
Yeah, she got away with it.
One of my other favorite figures, who's far more recent, he passed away, I think, in the very early 90s, was a gentleman by the name of Marcel Vogel, who was a research scientist for IBM for 27 years.
Yes.
Straight out of school, he went into the science field without a degree in anything because he was just a fucking genius. I mean, the man
Right.
The man was the consultant expert by the age of 16 for people writing dissertations in grad school on topics like bioluminescence and cold phosphor pigments. He invented the very first cold phosphor pigment of artificial origin in his garage as a teenager. We still use some of these compounds to this day. He is the forerunner of all liquid crystal research. He invented the LCD screen that we, thrive on today. And it was in part because he had this really pure understanding of the scientific method without the dogma attached to it, that he could break the rules, but he knew how he was breaking them. So he and his team at IBM had there are over 100 patents that he oversaw, many of which we still use today, some of which came to him in dreams and meditation. He was a devout Catholic. He wanted nothing whatsoever to do with the mystical woo-woo nonsense. He did meet an Indian yogi who came in to do some classes for the folks at IBM on creativity and things. And he was really inspired by some of the breath work. And it just so happened at some point in his life, someone gave him crystals and he kept losing them. And this woman kept mailing him more until he finally sat down and had an experience. And when he retired from the computer industry, he spent the remainder of his life studying psychic phenomena and spiritual healing with that scientific method. So he's kind of the grandfather of the modern crystal healing movement, and a lot of his teachings live on in my work, either directly or indirectly. And fairly recently, several weeks ago, in fact, his dear friend and close colleague, Rumi Da, just passed away, and he lived the remainder of his life here in Central Florida. So I was just so lucky to meet him, and he shared so much of Marcel's research with me. So that's another historic figure. So we've got people who lived 8 centuries apart who are a big part of my experience.
Is it Vogel was the one, because this will come across a lot of times, and I find it's one of those things where it's not somebody I have a problem with, it's just my hackles come up. But this idea of programming crystals, is that his terminology? Vogel was the one that came up with the terminology programming crystal or quartz. Is it not? Am I right there, or is that?
He definitely propagated the technique more than anyone else.
Okay.
I have yet to find clear use maybe of the word programming that seriously predates him. There are one or two that definitely might have used it concurrently or maybe a little earlier. People like Nick Nocerino or Dale Walker, who are kind of obscure in today's crystal world, but were really important figures in the 60s and 70s. But by the time Vogel came around in the 80s, computers were part of people's experiences. Most people didn't own one at home, but they understood some computer terminology. So he applied a lot of that thinking to what he did with crystals.
Right. It's so odd to think about all of these people that were at the forefront of inventing computers. I just found out recently that the gentleman who started or created the supercomputer literally he dug a tunnel under his kitchen so that he could commune with elves. I'm not making this up. I will send a link. I don't know if you've heard this story, but the guy who's if you look up supercomputer, he's the inventor of the supercomputer, and he would tunnel under his house because he said that he would get influence from the elves that lived in the earth. So this whole we live in a very materialist, rationalist culture right now, but a lot of the people that built the world around us believe some very odd things, and it's really quite amazing. I love it. Somebody like Edgar Cayce, do a lot of contemporary belief about crystals and stones, do they come from him for the most part, or are people starting to get away from Edgar Cayce?
I see a few different schools of thought here. I'm actually in the middle of teaching a course. Second part will be tonight on the history of crystal healing. We're going to focus on the last 200 years in tonight's course. So in the early 20th century, one of the bigger influences in the rise of modern crystal healing, as we know and love it today, is Edgar Cayce, known as America's Prophet and the Sleeping Prophet. And he did hundreds of thousands of life readings for folks in this trance state, and a surprising percentage of them discuss things like crystals, gemstones, metals, elements on the periodic table. And we have to put things in context, because these were really individuated kinds of prescriptions he was often giving. I use that term metaphorically and not medically here. So it's sometimes hard to take what he described for this one being, this one soul, and apply it universally when we don't all have the same stuff going on. But we certainly can kind of build a compendium, materia medica around this. I actually have a friend and colleague, Shelley Kerr, has written some of the most definitive works on Edgar Cayce's work with crystals, gems, metals, and elements on the periodic table. And she worked with the primary readings themselves. So I think some vestiges of his thought remain. For example, this idea that crystals were important to Atlantis, that comes from him. And we see all over the metaphysical milieu of the modern world this idea of Atlantis and Lemuria and crystal technology. Cayce describes what he called, I think, the tuoi, which were the fire stones, which were some kind of crystal that were the power source that were abused and caused the fall of Atlantis. And people have mythologized that even further through what I will graciously call personal gnosis.
Right.
Yeah, that's what we're going to call it. We're going to hold space for the fact that, that's someone's truth. And it definitely reaches into the modern crystal movement, but oftentimes anonymously. People don't necessarily know where these ideas truly came from. And Cayce had some really brilliant things. Cayce also had some really weird shit that doesn't track today with our modern understanding of geology. So, and that's okay. That was his gnosis, and I'm all for the influence that it's had.
So this goes back to a question that perhaps I had asked earlier, and there probably isn't any definitive answer, but when do you think stones, particularly in the modern, we'll say the modern period, when did stones and crystals become equated with healing, specifically healing itself?
Earlier than you might imagine. So late 19th century, early 20th century, we see the rise of the amateur folklorist. Of course, amateur folklorists had lots of money to fund their folklore habit, and then wrote books and sold them and went on tour and were regarded as professionals. The field of things like folklore and anthropology are really like self-made fields, and highly problematic. But around this time, we see that we've got folks like George Frederick Coons, who was very famously like the head gemologist for Tiffany and Company. He compiled folklore that he encountered in books like Rings for the Finger and the Curative Lore of Precious Stones and a handful of other things. There is virtually no crystal book that has written since the publication of his big one, the Curative Lore of Precious, the Curious Lore of Precious Stones, which I think the Dover edition initially came out in 1913. No book after that hasn't been influenced by it in some way. Maybe a more concise way to say that is every book published since then has been influenced by it one way or another.
Right.
Often quite indirectly, because later folks, some of whom were credentialed in really unique ways, like we've got medical doctors like William T. Fernie and occultists who were contemporaries of folks like Crowley and Gardner, W.B. Crow, who would write their own texts that highly are influenced by this one work. Other occultists, magicians, metaphysicians come through, they find these works, and you find little snippets of it there. And there's this really pervasive phenomenon. I'm trying to choose my words here in the crystal world, but we see it also in occult spaces and witchy spaces. They're in the kind of golden age of, we'll say, metaphysical witchy publishing. We didn't always document our sources very well as a community. You catch my drift? So there's a lot of influence is the word I'm going to use from one generation text to another. But really in this early 20th century, late 19th century, people start trying to apply this scientific method to it. And Jones describes experiments being done. Are they reproducible? Probably not. Are they peer-reviewed? Hell no. But people were applying this kind of methodology to exploring whether or not there was a psychic influence to gems, and that psychic influence often, had some ramification that we could describe as therapeutic or curative in some way.
Got it. Cool. Scenario time, Nicholas. And I like using the party scenario. It's always my go-to scenario for people. So you're at a party, word somehow gets out to the guests that you, Nicholas, are into crystals and stuff. And a skeptic comes up to you and says that there is no scientific validity whatsoever to anything that the New Age says that crystals can do. How do you respond?
I mean, firstly, I'm probably going to have a laugh with them because lots of things that are asserted have no scientific validity in our New Age community, and that is true. But what if we look at what they're saying through the lens of metaphor? What if we allow people to have their own personal experience where this rock or mineral that they're holding on to becomes a touchstone, a symbol for what they are aiming to achieve in their lives? What if this becomes the tangible reminder of what they're aiming towards? And that plants this powerful psychological seed that shapes the course of their life. So what they're working on may actually come to fruition. And nobody's going to argue with me on that. And then, we can start talking about placebo effect and nocebo effect and how they are repeatable and we can account for them. We document them over and over again. We can start to talk about some cursory research that's been done. There are a couple of not peer-reviewed studies, but still scientific things that have been explored using stuff like a squid, a superconducting quantum interference device that demonstrate the validity of crystal energy as a phenomenon. It is a thing that exists, but this pen also has energy that we can measure with a squid. So it's what makes that different. And if we just start to use electromagnetism as a metaphor, as a guide for how subtle energy, by its very nature, we can't measure it. I can't quantify subtle energy, and anyone who says they can is probably not very well informed, and that's okay. But if we look to how crystals, specifically quartz, because that's kind of what we use as our golden child, if you will, interacts with electromagnetism, we can look at light, we can look at piezoelectricity, we can look at the optical rotation of light moving through it, and other weird stuff that quartz does that most materials are completely incapable of, then maybe we could assert that there's something special in this relationship. And even if it's only metaphoric, let people have something that brings them joy, period.
Love it. Great answer. Let's hang on to quartz here, because I do find that quartz is the one that everybody, particularly skeptics, like to hold up and be like, look, it's the second most abundant mineral on Earth, and yet it can do everything from cure cancer to give people ecstatic experiences. But I do think there is something special about quartz, and I'll tell a story in a little bit about a scientific use of quartz. Like Nicholas just mentioned, that there are things that quartz can do, and there's one that I find really quite fascinating. But let's ask you, take us through what is so amazing about this overly abundant mineral that we call quartz.
Well, quartz behaves in some pretty unusual ways. Firstly, from a material standpoint, it's pretty durable. On the hardness scale, we rank at 7. Those numbers are really arbitrary. They're just kind of relative. A 7 will scratch a 6, a 5, a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1, but a 7 is not a certain percentage harder than a 6. Neither is an 8 a certain percentage harder than a 7. But because of that, it withstands the erosive nature of time. So humans have made stuff out of quartz for a very long time. That's probably one thing we got to take into account. And the other is it has some really fun relationships to light. It's a natural prism. If you have a prismatic, with crystal faces piece of quartz, like this little guy here, when light passes through it, we see it refract. We see it kind of splay light out into its incident component rays, that Roy G. Biv spectrum. But if we polish it, if we smooth it into convex or concave planes, it refracts light the other way, consolidates it to a focal point, and we can use that to start fire. We can use that it's theorized those are actually used to cauterize wounds at one point, and to start temple fires and do other things. We use quartz as an optical medium today. It has really weird physical properties, one of which is piezoelectricity. So it transduces one kind of energy into another. Transduction,
Yes,
like translation or conversion, in an energetic sense. if we take a little sliver of quartz and we apply force to it, it generates an electrical charge. Now,
it's awesome.
in spite of what a lot of crystal books from the 80s and 90s will tell you, there's no amount of like squeezing a crystal that's going to create an electrical charge. But fun fact, collagen is also piezoelectric, so you will generate a bigger electrical charge than that crystal will from that. Bone is also piezoelectric, but nobody knows why. That's a weird one. I don't have that answer, but neither does anyone else yet. So in reverse, we use quartz for timepieces and other devices because if you apply electricity to it, then it causes that same kind of mechanical deformation. And if we cut it from a pure enough piece of quartz at the right angle and to the right thickness, that means that it's going to wiggle a specific number of times, to be really unscientific about it. So any timepiece that has the word quartz somewhere emblazoned on it means there's a little sliver of silicon dioxide that is wiggling a specific number of times per second, and that's how we keep track of time that way. And it is reproducible. I mean, as long as that quartz is of requisite purity, we'll always do that. Quartz does a handful of other things. We can look at a whole bunch, and I like to use these as metaphors for what might be happening with our kind of psychic interactions. Let's look at the optics. Quartz has this ability to reflect and refract. It can show us what's happening under the surface. It can shift our focal point to other areas. It has the ability to translate or transduce energy from one state to another. What is the kind of emotional makeup of our goal, of our intention, and how can we make that speak the same language as the universe, and vice versa? How do we tap into the potential of the universe in a way that is tangible and real to us? Crystals are also oscillators. They're able to send and receive, to transmit specific, we'll say, groups of frequencies, and that makes them almost like antennas that boost our subtle signals. And most importantly, everything else that crystals do hinges upon their ability to cohere energy or information, and really coherent systems, really organized systems on a material level, generate really organized energy fields. So to back up a step further, everything is mostly empty space. Everything you can imagine is mostly nothing. And the little bits of something in that nothing are moving. And the smaller and smaller those little bits are, the more we magnify and look at their components, the less they behave like matter. But it's the interactions of these things that generate electromagnetism everywhere. If we didn't have it, the electron cloud and the nucleus of an atom would come together and things would cease to be, and that's problematic. So we've got to have these kinds of forces in motion. So these really organized substances like quartz, calcite, hematite, you name it, they speak a little louder than less organized things, like you and me, for example. We are not very coherent, structurally speaking, electrically speaking. I'll leave the rest to a case-by-case basis. But when we introduce these more coherent substances and their naturally organized energy fields to our own, they provide this template for how we can become more organized ourselves electromagnetically. And we do have robust data that tells us that an increase in heart-brain coherence, as well as other kinds of coherence in our electromagnetic field, begins to change the chemistry, the pathology of our bodies. It alters our mood and perception of things. It can improve positive mental affect, if we want to use medicalized jargon there, instead of making it all woo. And so there's a very real pathway by which crystals could influence us. Now, am I saying this is exactly what they do? I'd like to believe it is. I have zero data to support this, at least not from a study focused on quartz or other minerals. But the data suggests this is possible based on other things we have studied, other forms of energy medicine, other really clear and cogent studies of what happens with our electromagnetic fields and the resulting changes in it influencing the rest of our bits. So crystals have the potential, because of their organization, to help us be more coherent. And the side effect of that, everyone likes to say quartz is an amplifier. That's like your free gift of purchase. Greater amplitude is the side effect of being more organized. If you have all of the voices in a room, all of the, imagine you walk into a crowded space and everyone's just kind of mumbling, chattering, lots of conversations. If you're standing right outside that room, door closed, you hear nothing, maybe a little white noise, but there's no clear message coming through. You walk inside, if you walk up to a group of people, you hear that message, but there's nothing traveling far. But without anyone increasing volume, if they suddenly become coherent, if everyone is saying the same thing at the same time, reciting a poem, an affirmation, singing a song, without any shift in the individual volume, that coherent message can travel through that door. You're going to hear it with the door closed. You're going to hear it halfway down the hallway. Hell, you might hear it from the parking lot if there are enough people in that room contributing to that message. So yes, crystals amplify, but they don't actually raise the volume. They just get everything doing the same thing at the same time.
Awesome. I love that. And yeah, quartz is one of those things where if you even look at the scientific, fully rational, imperialistic aspects of quartz, it is so fascinating. I'm thinking specifically of, I want to tell the story of the Longevin sandwiches, where we got sonar from taking a sheet of quartz, putting it between two pieces of metal, zapping the quartz with a specific charge. It oscillates, changes shapes, sends out a signal, which is then hits surfaces, comes back and hits a receiver that is another Longevin sandwich, and we know the exact shape and distance of things. That's incredible stuff. That is so fascinating to me. I love it. I hope everybody goes back and rewinds and listens to everything that Nicholas just said there, because that is some very, very deep wisdom that you have there and is worth sitting with for sure. Of course, we do not have time to go through all of them, but what are a few either stones, gems, or crystals that you feel listeners need to know? And I know you've written a book, The 7 Archetypal Stones, and it is an amazing book. I want everybody, if this is interesting to you, to go grab that book, because I've read a lot of books on stones and crystals, and Nicholas is very persuasive in the way that he lays them out and gives space to each one of those 7 archetypal stones. But I guess what I'm asking you, Nicholas, is like, what are your favorite stones? Give me some of your favorite stones, okay, and maybe why people should know that they're your favorite stones.
Sure. I like that framework, because anytime I'm pressed to say, well, what should everyone have in their toolbox? I'm like, well, we're all different people.
Right,
so,
right.
Like, you should have the things that are good for you.
Hematite everything. Hematite and obsidian all the way down. Like, that's my stuff. I'm a Scorpio. We like dark and black things.
I have different kinds of favorites, like different categories of things that are my favorite for different reasons. And I'm going to start with my favorite because of its mythic underpinnings, and that's emerald. I've got a little emerald around my neck today. And this is a really magical mineral. It is a variety of the species beryl. So beryl is the source of beryllium on our periodic table. It's named after the substance. The substance gets its name from the word for spectacles, Brille in German, because we used to use it for optical materials. Unlike quartz, it is not birefringent, so it's not going to have that double refraction property. So it's better for making things like this. But specifically, when beryl has traces of chromium in it, it turns it green. There's a geological problem here. Chromium and beryllium don't occur in the same rocks under normal circumstances. So we have to take different, sometimes tectonic plates entirely, and bend and fold them together to introduce one of these substances to the other in the right set of circumstances that allows for beryl to form. So that makes them rarer than most other forms of beryl. We're going to have way more aquamarine and goshenite and morganite than we are going to have our emeralds. But emeralds feature in a lot of myths related to paradises, whether that's Eden or the holy paradise mountain that we see in Islamic texts. We see emeralds being associated with angels, both luminous and fallen, and everything in between. And I really appreciate this role that emerald has played as a kind of way shower and light bearer. And that motif of the light bearer is really important to my personal practice. And then we see that pretty much throughout history, emeralds are associated with the heart, not just because they're green and the modern chakra system uses green stones at the heart. That is the least, we'll say, persuasive thing that makes emerald related to the heart, even though that also exists in today's strain of thought. But there's this expansive quality that elevates the heart. If we look at the role of the light bearer, the Lucifer figure, as a bit of a rebel as well, I think one of the takeaways from Emerald is that it reminds us that love is a radical thing, and that in a society that gives us plenty of reasons not to love ourselves, we are not successful enough, beautiful enough, tall enough, rich enough, thin enough, muscular enough, whatever it is. Loving yourself in spite of that is a radical act, and a transgressive one that shakes up the status quo. So Emerald is my beloved transgressor. It is the one that helps me take time to prioritize maybe my self-care, but also community care, because those things are interrelated, and we got to lift one another up when we feel like we have fallen, like the Emerald of Myth. Another one that I just absolutely adore is Rhodonite. Rhodonite is interesting to me because I did not love it. I found it useful. So I bought some really nice rhodonite to wear for my anxiety disorder. I've been diagnosed with anxiety. I've grappled with that for young adulthood into adulthood. I mean, probably earlier, but we didn't have a label attached to it. It wasn't until I went away to college that I saw a professional like, yeah, so, we can treat this. This is a thing. I'm like, no, this is called life. This is just the way life is, right? And they're like, no, well, yes and no. So I tried a variety of things to keep that in check, from allopathic medicine to counseling to all kinds of things. And I'm pro finding the path that works for you and really embracing the marvels of modern medicine, but I never quite found the things that worked for me through that route. And so I've always taken a very integrative approach to managing it. And rhodonite was just a useful ally for me, just useful. And then it was there when life got rough. And then it was, oh gosh, I feel so good when I wear rhodonite too. I didn't leave the house without it for many years at a time. And then I found myself buying really nice pieces of rhodonite. And all of a sudden I thought to myself, I think rhodonite's one of my favorite crystals.
Hey.
Yeah, I think it is. I think I love it. I think everybody should love it, because it's a stone of, think of it as like emotional ballast. When the world is uncertain, when the waters are choppy, you don't feel like you're going to get knocked over by that. It helps you keep an even keel. It doesn't make the bad stuff go away, but it makes it feel a little more approachable and a little bit more digestible. And the longer we work with it, it has this knack for drawing out your gifts, your talents, your skills to apply them to your life in a meaningful way. I think one of the ways that manifested for me was writing, and I'm grateful for that. So rhodonite is just great. The other thing I love about it is, in between the publication of Crystal Basics and Crystal Basics Pocket Encyclopedia, its formula changed.
Oh.
Yeah. So
walk us through this. What happened?
Yeah. So I grew up knowing rhodonite as manganese silicate, MnSiO3. And that is the simplified formula that many of us still use today in the earth sciences. But the challenge of that is the idealized simplified chemistry just doesn't happen in nature often enough for people to really say that's what rhodonite's formula is. So in between the publication of that, enough samples were analyzed to see that, well, it's not one kind of manganese. There's actually more than one ion in there of different valencies. They've got different numbers of electrons.
Oh, cool.
And it was viewed that there just happened to be trace amounts of calcium in most manganese as an impurity. Well, they've redefined it as like an essential part of its chemical formula. So rhodonite is now calcium manganese silicate with a much larger base on there. It's like CaMn3MnSi5O15. So we've made it way more complicated. And I love that this stone that's helped me through the most complicated bits of my life is itself a little bit more complex than
complicated. I love it. That's great. Wonderful. We'll talk about some of the books you released, but you released Crystal Basics, and I believe there's a few years ago it was only 200, and then you just released one in May, Crystal Basics, the Pocket Encyclopedia, which is about 450. So you added to it. So in between the publication of those two, one of your favorite crystals was given a little update.
Yeah.
Amazing. Fantastic. Is there any other crystal that you really just like, I need to let people need to know about this?
My favorite thing to collect, I have like my favorite gem species, my favorite gem varietals of things. I have things that I love because they're beneficial to me, but my favorite thing to collect is the humble and yet still noble quartz. I love weird rocks, and because quartz is so widespread and occurs alongside so many other things, the likelihood of finding a weird one is really, really high.
Yeah.
Don't sell yourself short on the really humble common things. They're sometimes the most interesting because we can really see some variety out there. But they're also sometimes the biggest like workhorses that we're going to meet. They're the help meets, the allies, the kind of spirit intelligences that we're going to partner with the most frequently. And they've been working with us for so long that they know a thing or two about humans. Maybe only a thing or two, because they really seem to speak and think so differently to us. But they're there for us. So don't feel like you have to go out and get the most expensive thing. You have to get, the moldavites and phenicites and other things that are hard to say, barkevikites and metahewites and other things. Like, it's okay to just have a humble piece of quartz pebble that you found in the river. I promise you that has the potential to change your life if you invest in relationship with it.
I love it. Very well said, Nicholas. Dreams and crystals. Something that if you go into, say, certain older scrolls of magic, they'll say that there is something to it. But what do you make of the correlation between these two in your experience, Nicholas?
I really enjoy taking rocks to bed because the content and quality of what I experience in the dream time can be really revealing about the crystal. But we have to remember that there are filters taking place. So I think this is a really like primordial thing. We think about these like sacred dreaming temples that were made out of stone. They were caves. They were wattle and daub buildings made out of clay and earth. They were literally made of geologic materials. So dreaming inside the belly of the mother that is our planet, the geosphere, and more, is really, really an ancient thing. But we start to see, especially in the medieval period, a lot of fascination with the idea of the nightmare, about a specific flavor of dream and how to stave it off, because the explanation for how we got these things varied, but usually involved something unpleasant on our chest, smothering us and, trying to snuff out our life or our something, our light, our goodness. And the result was we had these bad dreams. So there's so much folklore relating specific rocks and stones to warding off dreams, but we even find those that talk about pleasant dreams and prophetic dreams and meeting spirits in dreams. There are biblical references to such things involving gems. So it's a really long standing tradition. But for anyone who's interested in doing this in their everyday practice with a modern kind of array of rocks at your disposal, I have a really good piece of advice that I'm going to paraphrase from one of my mentors in the world of crystal healing. Her name was Naisha Ozian. She changed it and retired, but people might recognize the name as the co-author of a popular book. But Naisha used to say that taking a crystal to bed can be a lot of fun, but it's usually not the best way to get to know it, just like people. And there's a tendency in the new age world, the moment you get that new rock, you are putting it under your pillow. But do you know it yet? Do you know how it's going to influence your nocturnal journeys? So there's nothing wrong with that. You can, of course, take that crystal to bed or that person to bed the moment you meet them. But the quality of that interaction is different than getting to know it first. So, just word of advice, you may have some really disruptive dreams from time to time if that is your getting to know you practice. I like to meet stuff in the mundane spaces and then the measured kind of mystical spaces before they join me for bed. But every now and then I break my own rules and throw caution to the wind. And I've also learned sharing a bed with someone, the things that don't disrupt my sleep might disrupt my husband's in one of two ways. The subtle kind of energetic. He could have weird dreams all night, and also sometimes things are pointy and he rolls over onto them. So I've made adjustments over the years.
Great advice all around, everybody. My show, for the most part, a lot of people come to it for the magic, the magic and the occult. Something I'm sure pretty much almost everybody listening to this is the scrying and seeing spirits or angels in crystals. So, what do you make of this very popular and historical magical practice, Nicholas?
I love it. I love the art of scrying. Before I had any real formal training in much, magically speaking, when I was a teenager and trying to get my hands on any book the local bookstores would carry, I discovered this practice of scrying. I say discovered like I had anything to do with it. I didn't.
Right.
It's been around way longer than I have, but I introduced it to my life. I bought a quartz sphere, which is currently actually on display in a museum. Part of the Nicholas Pearson collection's on display. That's kind of still strange to me. But every full moon, I made it my lunar ritual to practice scrying. And sometimes it was just a jumbled mass. Clearly, there was a lot of projection going on. And other times, there were clear moments of perception. But I think that it can be a really valuable tool for a lot of ways. For those of us that are, we'll say, a little bit more visually inclined or visually wired, that imaginal space that we enter through the art of scrying can be a healthy way to sort through the subconscious. I think in retrospect, I was probably discovering more of my own bullshit from that than I was doing anything predictive or spirit based. And that was helpful. I just didn't have that language at the time. And I also wonder how much of our revelatory experiences that have been recorded through the ages might be similarly projections from someone's stuff, to use a nicer term. Yeah, spirits and crystals go back to the prehistoric period. We have indigenous folklore that describes certain kinds of spirits associated with certain kinds of stones, or certain practices where you could conjure or adjure a spirit of some kind to a stone. So there's a really long historic precedent for this, and some of the future work I'll be undertaking probably next year is going to involve writing about this very topic. It won't give much away, but I find it a really fascinating topic, and I also think it's really fun to see what is universal and what is different at the same time. Because if we get too universalist about stuff, we erase important nuance in culture and language and time. But also, if we focus on what is so individuated, we lose the ability to relate to it. So it's been a challenge for me these last few years especially, not in a bad way. It's an enjoyable challenge to make sure that we can be both respectful of those differences and still find meaning among the universal.
Definitely. So this is the question that I really have to ask, because I would say, in my own experience, at least because of my circles are somewhat more occultish, new ageist, the spiritual, the woo stuff. We'll just call it all the woo stuff. That crystals are ubiquitous. No matter where you go, they're everywhere. So how did crystals become so mainstream? You can buy them anywhere now. Every place sells them. It's quite shocking. I lived out in the rural Alberta, and to try and, besides the stuff that my dad would bring home, which he would bring home very often, or we'd go out and find stuff. If I wanted to get a little crystal and necklace, I had to go into the city, into in a city of 1 million people, the one store that had crystals and weird necklaces and stuff like that. Now they're everywhere. You can go to a gas station and they're there. So how did this happen over a space of 20 years?
I mean, the short version is capitalism, right?
Yay!
Whatever will turn a profit is what people are going to turn a profit on. But it is more complex than that. It is definitely more nuanced, and it's a lot of moving pieces. So when we start to look at how the influence of the modern spiritual movements, and we'll keep that plural because I, again, don't want to universalize too much, we start to see them making their way into the mainstream through art and other media. We start to have the information age of the internet, where it's easier to disseminate ideas, to connect with people who think and practice similarly or differently to enrich your practice. And we also, have e-commerce. So you don't have to go to that one place in a city of a million. I grew up in very small town in the southeastern part of Florida, and I was blessed that there was actually more than one place to buy crystals. It was shocking to me, but that was possible. Not all of them lasted very long, but some of them really had some staying power. And um, today with e-commerce, you can do anything. You can buy anything from everywhere, and that's not always to say that we should, but you can. This concept really overlaps with discussions about the ethics of mining and extraction, about the exploitation of human labor and the damage to the earth and the environment, and all kinds of other things that are not unique to the crystal world. They are quite universal to the discussion about capitalism. I mean, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. We do the best we can with the tools we've got, but unless you go out into the wilds and pick up that rock yourself, there's no way to know its entire story and the footprint left by that story. So, it's sometimes hard because we ask one question and then we end up having to answer several others at the same time. We can thank or curse this proliferation for accessibility. I think every doorway in is an important one, and especially post 2020, which I know is very recent, but we could even back that up to increasing senses of urgency in the world, spiritual, social, environmental, economic crisis that people experience either on an individual and personal level or on a wider planetary one, depending on how myopic our vision might be, with the need to find answers. And so we've got a boom in metaphysical and occult publishing. We've got the rise in businesses that cater to folks who think and practice like us. We have this globalization that enables us to transmit ideas from place to place at an unprecedented rate. And so more doors have opened, and more people feeling displaced and in need of answers come to occult spaces, come to magical spaces, witchcraft, to metaphysics, to energy medicine, because they don't find home in other places, or they still have answers no matter what that home looks like. I think it does us a greater service to celebrate those doorways in rather than to talk about how problematic they are. But two things can be true at the same time. I think I'm rambling, and I don't know that I've given you a concise answer, but
no, I like it. You really did. If you'll excuse the pun, you really did drill down into what I was asking. There seems to be a real need. I think there's a pushback against this really enlightenment, rationalist, materialist way of being with the world. And I recently watched a documentary about George Carlin, who was uber atheist. Before the end of his life, he was the most atheistic man on earth. And in the 5 years before he died, he had a wife, but his wife passed away and he met another girlfriend who became the love of his life. And it was through her influence that the last 5 years of his life, he had a crystal, he had quartz. He would bring quartz on stage with him. He would carry quartz with him everywhere. So he hated the idea of God, and yet he still found room for this kind of spiritual otherness that he doesn't know what it is, but he still felt like it had some agency in his life. And I'm seeing that more and more, even with just people just like, yeah, I have this thing that does this other thing for me. So I think it's really quite incredible.
it
Bodes
is.
well for us.
It does, absolutely. And that's, if that isn't so emblematic of where the world is at, where the systems that are in place are frequently divisive, derisive, and disempowering. And anything that we can practice that even gives us a seed of hope, a modicum of agency, like, let's lean into that. And if we can do that in supportive ways, if we can do that cooperatively and collaboratively, whether that's I am collaborating with this crystal rather than treating it as an inert piece of matter that's going to fulfill a certain goal that I've got, or collaboratively in a communal sense, like the people who practice with you, alongside you, nearby you, who challenge you, because any teaching that leaves us unchanged or unchallenged is not a worthy one, to paraphrase Raven Grimassi, much beloved witchcraft author. Yeah, it's what a time to be alive.
Indeed. I love it. I have a couple of questions here from people that support my show on Patreon. Every once in a while, I let them know who the guest is and I let them ask some questions. So here's a few of them. The first one is, and the people need to know, does someone else touching your crystals mess them up?
Well, potentially, but probably not in the way this person is asking.
Okay.
So I collect fine mineral specimens, and I have things that not even my husband will handle, because if they're not placed on that shelf perfectly, things fall off, flake off. There are things that can be done. Now, he's also my photographer for all of my books. So
cool.
Sometimes that means I have to carry things and stand over his shoulder and say, no, that's not the right angle. And we have to like work with things. He's got to know the mechanics of lighting and the physics of that lens. And I have to be able to move the crystal so the right thing is facing it. But apart from like the material sense of, yeah, someone can break something you love, energetically, there is this idea that persists of other people's energy contaminating your crystals. And if they touch
Contamination, yes.
yeah. But I think that says a lot about the idea itself. If this thing is so pure, so coherent in a material sense, its stuff is really organized, and so regularly the same stuff over and over again, then its energy field is the same way. Like, what harm can someone do? How can the force of someone's own thought, emotion, energy, aura be so pollutive to this thing that it's going to mar it permanently? Now, I believe crystals have memory. I believe that they retain a kind of energetic imprint of things, like a tape recorder might if it were playing. But we cleanse them. And the other thing about this is that what makes you think people's energy starts and stops with the boundary of their skin cells?
Right.
Because your energy field, just from an electromagnetic perspective, is massive, is like hundreds of feet away, depending on your state of being, consciousness, and what's around you, and what kind of equipment we're using to measure it. You know, the heart is something like 80 to 100 times more powerful magnetically than the brain, and it fills a room and then some. If you're passing someone on the street and you've got a 12-foot berth between you, their energy field is still touching your crystals. So we have to understand that the innate intelligence of that stone, if we are going to be animists, we haven't talked about it yet, but like at heart, you know, when I put my science stuff out there, it sounds like everything is very methodical and very like we're going to use physics as our understanding, but I'm still a feral animist at heart. Like, there's spirit in these things, and if I wouldn't be here.
Right.
We gotta like trust that the spirit of this stone has its own agency as well.
Well put. Love it. Yes, the A word. I love using the A word. But it is true, and that is always the approach that I try to have with these kind of things. It's like, and here's the other thing: these things they're around for millions of years. They're going to be here for another couple million years for the most part. Your stone's fine. That's just the way that I look. Your stone's usually going to be okay, even if like the worst person on earth touches it. And I'm not saying this to be dismissive of the question, but it is a question that people do get, because it even is asked in the realm of cards. Don't let other people touch your tarot cards. This is just this idea of contamination that I think a lot of people get hung up on. I think it's not really that big of a deal. Let's move to another question that a listener had, a supporter had, used the word recording. So, Nicholas, are you familiar with what is called the stone tape theory?
I might, maybe by a different name.
So there's this idea that ghost sightings, particularly in places like haunted houses and old mansions or at megalithic sites, things like this, is that the stones themselves somehow, and this was popularized by T.C. Lethbridge, who really interesting chap. I'll say that. I like some of what he talks about. Some of the other stuff he talks about is very okay. Popularized pendulums in some way. But this idea that the stones of the earth or the things used in certain buildings can record emotions, scenarios that we, at a later time, can be witnessed to. So the stones themselves are like little tape recorders that every once in a while, unknowing to us and by some mechanism that we have no idea how it works, we step on the play button. And I'm using a very analog that to Nicholas and I, we know what we're talking about. We had Walkmans, but maybe everybody else doesn't really know. But yes, the stone tape theory. What do you have any perspective on this?
Oh, I do. And there was actually a guy who was a solid state chemist and materials scientist named Don Robbins who wrote a book in the 1980s called The Secret Language of Stone that expands upon this further and actually describes the mechanisms by which this phenomena is activated.
Okay.
It's a fascinating book. Some of the science goes over my head. I haven't read it in a long time, but maybe I'd get more of it today. I see a little bit of similarity between the theories that he proposes and some of the stuff that Marcel Vogel did with crystals, talking about their memory, their ability to program and record things. So yeah, there's this, so far, we have talked about the inherent perfection of crystals, but the truth is that nature is perfectly imperfect. We could also say imperfectly perfect, but I like the former. And it is by virtue of these imperfections that there is room for these kinds of phenomena to take place. So how do crystals have memory? Because of tiny little aberrations that we call lattice defects. In Crystal Basics, the big one from 2020, I've got some diagrams that illustrate some really highly simplified point defects where something is substituted for something else, something is missing, and its complement has to be missing. So we achieve the same, valency, the same charge at the end of the day. An ion can migrate to the wrong part of the crystal structure, but it's like having an empty space on your bookshelf. So something can be caught in there. It's a little groove on this really tiny level, and the shape of the bonds changes. We get color in a lot of minerals from these kinds of imperfections, either by ionic substitution or other things where something fits in where it shouldn't, it changes the shape of the bond. So photons of a specific wavelength get stuck or filtered out or reflected accordingly. So we know that those are happening in really real kinds of ways. Vogel actually studied this phenomenon in the science lab to account for some of the stuff involving computer memory. We do not use quartz for computer memory, contrary to popular opinion. We use silicon, not silica. They're different things. So silicon is a semi-metal that's on the periodic table. It's one of the elemental components of quartz, of alpha silicon dioxide. But we can grow this sort of semi-crystalline, quasi-crystal in the laboratory to have a certain number of defects in it. It's like doped to have these empty spaces where things like photons or electrons can be stored and retrieved. And what we see in Lethbridge's theory, in Robbins's theories, is that the requisite input will trigger the same kind of output. Said differently, when the right frequency matches the frequency at which something is stored, it can be retrieved. So one of the interesting ways this is being used in the future of computing and like quantum computing is like storing things in crystal structures holographically, and they use lasers for this, usually in lab-grown crystals that don't exist in nature, stuff like lithium niobate and other fun stuff. So you get these two lasers and they gotta like meet and create an interference pattern. If hypothetically one of those lasers, and I'm going to really oversimplify here, it's far more complicated than this, but let's just say we had the wrong color laser. We used a green one instead of a red one. It can't meet with the other one to form the right interference because it's the wrong wavelength of light, it's the wrong frequency, and it's not going to store or retrieve stuff because it's not enharmonic to what's in there. So Robbins talks about acoustic theories and how sounds in particular can be representative of the ways that silica-rich rocks, things that contain quartz, could interact with these stored patterns through piezoelectricity, through electromagnetism. So we have this sonic thing. Sound is a vibrating column of air. It's a mechanical force on very, very minute levels, like picowatts or smaller. It's influencing crystals in this kind of electrical way and releasing whatever's stored in those subatomic grooves, these smaller than molecular grooves inside the crystal lattice, and just playing whatever is in there.
I was not expecting that awesome of an answer. but I love it. It's incredible. Yeah, it's one of those things where when you first look up stone tape theory, it was literally based that the name was from a TV movie. The guy in Britain, the guy wrote Quartermass, and he came up with this idea of stone tape was the name of the TV made for TV movie. Anyways, it's a really interesting idea, really interesting theory. Man, Nicholas, that was an incredible answer. Oh my gosh. I would love to hang on it for a bit longer, but we have other questions. Okay, so here's the final listener question here. Some folks have had experiences where they do classic meditations, but while holding crystals, and many have said that the experience of doing so carries with it a different and even more meaningful experience. What do you make of this?
Well, if we go back to like those fundamental properties of crystals, they cohere or harmonize stuff. The side effect of that is they also amplify, they reflect and refract our point of focus, but also energetically. They record. We didn't talk about that until this last question, but we got to lump that in with these fundamental properties. They're natural oscillators, electromagnetic oscillators, so like antennas that send and receive, and they translate stuff. All those things are converging together to build this kind of synergistic experience that we've got with crystals. So whether we perceive that as like an augmented kind of meditative experience or enhancing ritual, or we'll say catalyzing a magical effect if we use them as materia magica, this is probably why. I mean, I would like to believe this is why we have megalithic sites where, sacred space is chosen very intentionally, and the rocks are sometimes carried from very, very far away, according to at least some experts, and why we have rocks that have been left in specific configurations, why specific gems are used in certain ways, why people were buried with this kind of crystal or that kind of thing. Because those kind of background properties are always at play to enhance our relationship with the world around us in a very kind of cosmic and esoteric way.
Awesome. There is something that you touched on a little bit earlier that perhaps we can expand upon, because it's the 21st century and we do need to talk about it. Quite a few of the crystals that you will find, be they in the gas station now or even in stores that say that they're doing the good thing, but somehow you know that they're not, is that a lot of these crystals are they're procured from sources that are not the very best. They use child labor. They're from countries wherein warlords are running the countries. It's really not good. What impact do you think that this aspect of gems and crystals and stones has, not only for conscientious practitioners, but for the stones and crystals themselves? And how can we ensure that the crystals that we get, if it's not just us literally going out and grabbing them, are ethically sourced?
Firstly, I want to thank you and your supporters for having space for this kind of conversation, because the truth is there's not a satisfying soundbite I can give anybody about this.
Yeah.
I have taken large swaths of time to have conversations, and there are still stones left unturned, pun intended, I'll admit.
Love it.
And we're not going to solve this problem in a single bullet point on one interview on a single podcast, right? But what I think is really hopeful is that I keep getting asked questions like this, which means people keep contemplating it. There is a larger dialogue happening. So to that credit, the challenge of ethics in this is that it exists in a greater context. To reiterate the point, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. The idea of capitalism is that it exploits the value of our labor in favor of the value of capital, right? So something's got to give.
Right.
But there is a greater trend in especially the Healy-Feely world to want to buy direct from the people doing the labor themselves, to ensure transparent chains in terms of supply, to ensure that the least amount of harm is being done to the environment, and that we can try to label things as best as possible. But the truth is that even though terms like ethical crystal, ethically sourced crystal, consciously sourced crystal are increasingly higher in terms of search engine results, like people are Googling these crystal related terms more than other crystal related terms now, there's nothing to stop someone from labeling a crystal as ethically sourced, because that term is not regulated.
No.
I would like to believe most people using that term are doing so to the best of their knowledge. But here's where we can kind of shift the conversation to, like, what do we do about it?
Yeah.
We start with consumers asking questions. And the first question we can ask, that whether or not it has an ulterior motive, is not going to put people on the defensive and shut things down. And that's, hey, could we talk about provenance? I'm a collector. I love to work with crystals for their energetic value, but I also love to know, like, where in the world they come from. So could you tell me where this specimen of hematite comes from? Do you know, place of origin on this agate over here? Or I noticed this quartz has a really unusual habit or strange inclusions. I've not seen that elsewhere. Could you tell me where it comes from so I could learn more about it? And if we start with this conversation, then it opens the door to other things. So if we know where something comes from, there are indexes we can use online to look at labor practices, mining practices, extraction practices, and find out if some of these areas are, statistically speaking, kind of problematic in the way that they exploit human labor or commit atrocities to the environment, or all of the above. That alone doesn't rule things out, because let's look at some place like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's some pretty horrific things being done there, all across the board, the human, the environmental, the social, the economic, when it comes to mining and extraction. But we don't have good data that reflects only the healy-feely market.
Right.
And yes, there are some really scary op-ed pieces that have been penned, the dark side of crystals and other stuff that gets out there that's really sensationalized. And those things are based on factual research. They also are only a reflection of the state of mining in the world at large. And so if we go to a place like the Congo, where we know that there are conflict materials being mined, stuff like niobium and tantalum and cobalt, oh gosh, cobalt. These kinds of minerals are found in association with stuff that you're going to find in your crystal healing suppliers shops, like malachite, azurite, shadokite, chrysocolla, cornatite, and the list goes on and on and on. The big mining operations that are committing the atrocities, throw that shit out. They do not care. The indigenous folks doing the labor oftentimes can now monetize this and sometimes get paid what they're worth for the waste of the big mining operation. So we have to see that one event creates helpful, justice-oriented opportunity in some cases, and is also problematic at the same time.
Yeah.
And the people who are the loudest voices in the virtual rooms about the crystal market and its unethical implications are posting their videos via devices made from the worst of these conflict materials. They are doing up their faces with makeup full of pigments and micas that are mined by child slave labor. They are driving to the store to pick it in far worse sins when it comes to transportation and infrastructure. So nothing exists in a vacuum. Does that mean that it absolves us of responsibility? Absolutely fucking not. But also, if this is 1% of all consumption from mining and extraction and we make it better, 99% of it is still really problematic. So how do we circumvent this? We have those conversations about provenance. We look for people who are transparent about their supply chain. And that doesn't mean telling you who their sources are. Most people who live under capitalism aren't going to tell you, oh, I bought this from Jim up the road. He sells it to me for this price, because then you're going to go to Jim up the road and buy it for that price.
Right.
So I'm not looking for people to give away their trade secrets, but to talk about sourcing, philosophically. We can also buy things that are secondhand. Buy things from the charity shop, from the vintage shop, from whatever. Buy things from people who are recycling jewelry and metals to make new jewelry out of. We can go to people who do the collecting themselves. Local rock and mineral shows are a great place to do this. Buy from old collections. Buy from people who collect specimens for scientific value. Their approach is often different, not always, but often different than those who are going out for monetary or ornamental or industrial value. And, those are things that we can do that have agency. And of course, get to know the rocks underneath your feet. Granite is magical. Limestone is full of healing potential. Working with that humble piece of quartz that you find in the riverbed, getting to know the flints and the chalks of the earth, those are really important allies to consider. And that was one of the deciding factors in how I chose what kinds of things to include in the Pocket Encyclopedia that just came out this year. I wanted to make sure there was space for the things people know and love and expect, and the really weird stuff that makes me get excited, but also common rocks. So that way we can have this conversation about decolonizing and deconsumerizing our practice.
Awesome. That is such a fantastic answer, Nicholas. And I really hope people took that to heart. And again, it's another segment. Maybe go back and re-listen to that entire. It is rough out there in this day and age, but awareness is always key. Let's go back to the A word, the animist word. So I was very lucky. Again, my dad would take me, we would go to Burgess Shale, we'd crack open rocks. I'd get to see trilobites and all of these crazy, like my dad would take me to Arizona. We'd go to Arizona, Lake Havasu, just walking around in the desert there. There's quartz just laying around. And I'd go back to Alberta and they would sell it for, I don't know, like $400 in Arizona. That shit is just lying around in the desert. It's crazy to me. I was very lucky. But I have to ask you, because I do think that there is some kind of agency to these rocks, but is there a way that one can take these things from places without feeling something bad? Like when does a stone become alive to us? And is there a reason to go along this whole leave no trace policy that one can have? Because part of me is about, and magic specifically, I'm talking about myself personally, is about enrichment and re-enchantment of my world. And part of that is bringing things from other places to bring into my life. And sometimes they get returned, sometimes they won't. But what do you make of this whole situation, this whole idea of stones having an agency, having a spirit to themselves, and you bringing them with you?
Yeah, this is really kind of the we'll say skeleton of what my work is built on these days, and it's often really subtle, but it's there regardless. So I want to start by answering this question: when do stones become alive to us? With another question, which I know is an etiquette faux pas, but like, when are stones not alive to us?
Right.
At what point do we view their spirits as non-existent? And what does that say about us? It doesn't say anything about the stones. I know a lot of people. I have a day job in an occult bookstore. We sell a lot of rocks. I might be partially responsible for that. I am still gobsmacked when I meet people who say, "Oh, well, that's been polished. It doesn't feel alive to me," or "It's not as powerful as a rough one," or "I don't want it because it's been altered." And there's this kind of false dichotomy that exists, that this thing, which is in its rough state, is somehow more pure than this thing that has been carved and polished. And one of the problems here comes from a complete and utter lack of understanding of how any of these got to us.
Right.
This is not how it existed in the earth. This had to be separated from a much larger mass. It probably had to be cleaned, sometimes acid washed. Some of the things that look really rough and raw go through industrial crushers. A crusher is a piece of equipment that smashes stuff. So that way they can be broken down to the same size and sorted and cleaned up and sold for the same price, because we like uniformity when we buy stuff, especially at the tonnage level, which has to happen at some point in the supply chain. So nothing hasn't been processed unless you go get it yourself or have someone who's doing just that. And chances are the things that you think of as rough and raw and pure are no more or less pure than anything else. So we're doing a lot of projection, and we are missing the point of animism. There is nothing without a spirit. If it exists, if it has form, and I don't just limit that to physical form, we can think of psychic form, we can think of Platonic form in terms of archetypes and egregores. If there is form, it has spirit, it has consciousness, it has its own agency. But how that manifests in the material is obviously going to vary from substance to substance and form to form. Rocks don't have a lot of physical agency. And when they do start to move on their own, like, we got to watch out, like, what's happening, what fault lines are moving and colliding, what is being subducted. So they have to partner with their environs to make change, whether that's through, the breakdown of big rock into little rock and smaller rock into soil, through collaboration with the elementals, with collaboration with the animal and botanical worlds, or whether that's through collaboration with us in the erection of our edifices, not just our ancient stone structures, but our modern high rises are built of steel and concrete, which are made out of minerals. So there's a spirit in all these things. And the moment we start to, I think, over categorize and over conceptualize of something as pure, we've already missed the point. We're already not listening to the voice inherent in stone. We're listening to the voice inside our ego that's trying to make us feel better in some way. Our ego is supposed to be a tool that we use to interface with the world around us. Your spirit goes, I am one with everything. And your ego goes, that might be true, but I'd rather these molecules not be one with the molecules of the bus hurtling towards me as I try to cross the street. So I'm going to get the fuck out of the way. Like, your ego's supposed to be useful to you, but it's the misidentification with our own egos that allows us to misidentify what's happening around us too. So we got to take a step back and keep that in check and go, okay, what is speaking to me? Is this perception or projection? And projection can be really useful, but it's not the same as perceiving the voice in that stone, that twig, that flower, that boulder, that mountain, that stream, that breath of air you just took in. So I think it's all alive. Are there different orders of consciousness? Yes, but I don't mean that hierarchically. It's a Venn diagram of lots of messy overlapping circles, and we create vertical hierarchies so our linear egos can make sense of it, but it's a misattribution of relationship. We are also cells in the body of the earth, just like the stones. So when we collaborate with them, when we dig them up, when we polish them, when we turn them into buildings, refine them into ores, create healing layouts or crystal grids, we are still collaborating with other cells in the body of the planet. And the moment we forget that is the moment we lose the magic.
That's beautiful. I love that. That is so well put, Nicholas. Thank you so much. It's not that I don't understand the sentiment of like leave no trace, but there is this separation that we have, and the N-word nature always gets brought up, and to me, I keep trying to tell and remind folks on the show, and it's an ugly truth, but nature only exists to the cultures that have separated from it. It's one of those things where it's very much like you say, a collaborative, relational element. And again, people go back, rewind, re-listen, because there is some deep truth there that Nicholas brought. So we're coming to the end here. Nicholas, let's say you've convinced some of the skeptics, or even just you by virtue of your awesome answers, people are like, I want to get involved in stones and gems and crystals. I want to involve them in my life in some way. So this is going to be a little bit of a bulleted question here. How do people start picking the right crystals? What do people start doing? Is there little exercises that one can do? How does one get started to be as awesome as you is basically what I'm trying to ask.
Well, thank you. So first and foremost, start with what you love. What attracts your eye, whether you're out in nature with a capital N or, nature, which is the world around you. So in the forest, on the mountain, in the shop, wherever you are connecting to rocks, like what draws you in, and start there. Because if you don't love it, if you choose it prescriptively, you're not going to keep it up.
No.
And then, if you don't love it, you're not going to engage in the practice. You're just not going to keep it up. So that's really imperative. I think in the beginning, it's much better to focus on the easy things. If I say, here's a list of meditations you have to master before you can move on to other stuff, or this is a specific ritual you have to undertake with every single crystal, most humans are probably going to go, no thanks. And instead, I like to keep things organic. My beginning exercises, I call them crystal contemplations, because even the M word, say meditation, it can scare some people off. It can sound too woo-woo for some. It can sound too arcane and like unattainable to others. So here is your homework assignment, should you choose to accept it. Pick up a rock from nature, crystal from the store, piece of jewelry that's already in your collection. Find some really good light. It could be natural, it could be artificial. Do the best you can with the tools you got. And your job, your number one priority, is to be in wonder at the beauty of this object. Turn it every which way in the light and see how light passes through it, reflects off the surfaces. Get to know the shapes of the angles and faces, the geometries of it. See the nuance in color and texture. If you've got something with multiples of these going on, take a look at them. Bring a magnifying glass if you want and see how it all fits together. And then start to engage your other senses responsibly. Please don't lick your rocks. I say that because every rock hound, every geologist is going to lick their rocks. That's calculated risk. I used to work in the museum field. I licked a lot of rocks behind closed doors, never in front of the public.
Right.
And most of the time, things were what I thought they were.
Yeah.
And once or twice, it was like, oh, this is some kind of borate that I should not have put in my mouth.
Oh.
Let's see what happens over the next hour. And I've always been fine because calculated risk, right? Otherwise, use all your other senses.
Yes.
What is the texture? Is it resonant? Sometimes you pick up a rock and you can tap it with your fingernails, or it touches the surface and it rings or pings or dings, and you can get that kind of auditory sense. You can sometimes, when things are attached to matrix, they have an aroma. Iron and copper minerals, particularly sulfides, frequently have aromas, especially if they're decaying. So we got to be careful. Again, don't lick the rocks. Right. Sulfide minerals can break down to like sulfuric acid and other stuff. So like really just don't do it.
No.
But as we employ all of our senses, we start to do two things. We are building a lexicon of what things really look like, how things really feel, how to perceive them more intentionally. And the other side of it is, as we're beginning to catalog this, our conscious mind is so enraptured with this that our subconscious mind just automatically goes into relationship. It's like the back door to communing with the spirit of something without having to know how to commune with the spirit of something. And
yes,
the more you do it, the more you start to take self-inventory. Maybe it's not until after you put the crystal down that you start to notice, wow, every time I pick up this piece of hematite, I feel so calm, so stable, so rooted. Or when I hold this amethyst, I feel really serene and open and maybe a little bit more perceptive of what's happening. Or maybe there's a particular unpleasant sensation you get. Embrace that too. I think so much of like the Healy-Feely crowd is like, find the crystals that make you feel sparkly and radiant and luminous. And they neglect to remind you that those are probably things that represent energies you've mastered, you've integrated. And it's the ones that feel unpleasant, maybe downright shitty, that have the greatest healing potential. That doesn't mean buy a 10-pound piece of that and carry it with you everywhere you go. That's going to make life really unpleasant. I've done that. Learn from my mistakes.
Oh, okay.
Like, measured doses is better, but start from this space of, I'm in wonder of this object, this tool, this spirit being, and I start to notice how it makes me feel. And the more we engage, the more we start to notice how it makes us feel, then we're also building a lexicon of subtle energy, not just the material stuff. Oh, hematite has this heft, it reflects in this way, it is usually this range of colors, and so on and so forth. So you can start to identify stuff. That's my science nerd showing through. But the rest of it is, I start to become more self-aware. Remember, crystals reflect to us. Part of what they're reflecting is not themselves, but our own shit. So if we don't repeat this, if we don't have a big enough sample set, we might go, every piece of amethyst does this for all people.
Right.
And I think a lot of crystal books are written that way.
Yeah.
Not accounting for the fact that that one piece of amethyst reflected this one thing to that author. And they took the surface level, the face value, and ran with it. Other people are expected to do the same. But when we build our personal relationship and take that self-inventory, then maybe there's space for us to have those aha moments where instead of looking at the surface, we can take inventory of the mechanism driving those surface level results. And that's where I occupy my time with crystals. How did for anyone who's able to see, I don't know if it's just you or if your listeners will, but I've got about 500 or so books just on crystals behind me.
Yeah, it's a lot of books.
A lot of them are not so scientific. And although there are trends, people think of rose quartz as loving and amethyst for something spiritual. There's also a lot of differences from book to book. So how did they all get to that place? Sometimes I can't see the leap in logic or personal gnosis because it is personal. But most of the time, if you look hard enough, you start to connect the dots. So I think of my great gift, like if I had one special skill set, it's just meta-analysis. I'm just looking for patterns, and I buy and pour through books obsessively. So I get to take one of my hobbies of book buying and turn it into something useful here. We can do our own meta-analysis by looking for those patterns inside. But if I tell you your job is to seek the pattern, you're probably in the beginning not going to know how to. So start with the easy. Contemplate what is magical about this thing and how it makes you feel.
Would you say that it would be more beneficial for folks, because I tell folks for the most part in dealing with a different part of the mineral world, the plant world, I guess it's not a mineral world. So what is already in your area? Would you recommend for folks, go to the backyard, go to your area and perhaps try to, or would you say, you know what, if you love the look of, I don't know, something that comes from a different continent and you just are able to find it, to sit with that, whatever moves, you follow it? Or would you say it might be a bit more beneficial to start local is basically what I'm saying. What do you have to say about something like that?
I'm a both and kind of guy. You know, I love collecting minerals. The last couple of years, I've especially loved collecting rocks. It takes a special kind of person to love something that to everyone else is just a lump of rock.
Right.
But that's been my recent hobby is geo-regional rocks in particular. We see big trends, as you were alluding to bioregionalism in our spiritual practice. There's also, for a long time, there's been a bioregional trend in medicinal herbalism, and it's spilling over into other areas, but I don't see people talking about the concept of geo-regionalism very much. So that's something I've been trying to aim my platform towards. It's useful if we want to circumvent the ethical implications of the long supply chain and the unknown origins. But it's also really cool because you might find out that the bedrock your home is built on is exactly the magic you need in your everyday life. A little of column A, a little of column B, but definitely get to know what's in your backyard if you can.
That is wonderful. And your advice for those starting out is fantastic. Find something. And I like the idea of putting it in very good light and just forming that relationship. Magic is, in its expressions, very artful, but it's in its interpretation is very relational. I will say that. Is there any books that you say would be good? I know because your books are really quite wonderful, but is there other books or areas that you think that people starting out in this kind of thing should lean towards? Would you say maybe start with the more scientific and just starting to learn the Latin names of these things? Or how would you say with the babe, besides just having the crystal or the stone and staring at it, baby's first steps into integrating and onboarding this kind of information? What would you say best practice would be?
So I think all spiritually inclined crystal lovers benefit from learning geology.
Yeah.
But it can be geology for beginners, rocks for jocks style. We're not worried about the complex geochemical interactions here. Is this a sedimentary formation? Is it igneous? Right. The basics. And any decent field guide to rocks and minerals is going to be good to this. You can get it region specific. You can find out, I'm sure someone publishes a book about the rocks and minerals where you live, at least somewhat nearby where you live. But even just a general one, a good compendium of minerals and rocks is good to have. Simon & Schuster publishes them. There's the Peterson Field Guides. There's a million of them. So having a little handy encyclopedia that just gives you the science. What are its common colors? What is its crystal system, its hardness, its streaks? That way you could learn to identify if you had to. And also because the metaphysical books don't always get it right when they report on the science, it is really nice to have something to fall back on. Yeah. And if you'd rather not buy a book, there's a free online database that you can do. It's called mindat.org, mindat.org. It's short for mineral database, so that's easy to remember.
Yeah.
This place was moderated by a group of earth scientists, people who are geophysicists, geologists, gemologists, and so on and so forth, people whose disciplines are there. And sometimes it's just really basic, boring stuff. And other times you'll find some really good historic data and other stuff that can help with ID. Plus, they've got probably millions of pictures now. So you can look at the same kind of mineral species from many different parts of the world and see how it's not always going to look exactly like that tumbled stone that you bought in the store. And that's also really good for ID because it helps us not limit ourselves to just color because there's so much more involved. So that's a really great resource for everyone who wants to learn the science part of it. But then also, like, a big part of my shtick that we haven't really talked about is marrying the science to the energy.
Right.
If we know something is rich in iron, there is a perceivable kind of energy that is fairly universal. Like throughout human history, people describe iron-rich materials in similar ways, even when they couldn't have shared the ideas by boundaries of geography, language, or time. And that was like my big aha moment when I was working in the earth science field, starting to really build my collection of crystal healing books. I'd find a work in translation from 5 centuries ago, and then a modern crystal healer who clearly never read this book. They're like, wow, they both described iron oxides the same way. They just picked 2 different iron oxides. The law of averages tells me this is statistically unlikely. So, when we learn that stuff, we can make those kinds of connections. So if you're interested, and here's how I get to be a shameless self-promoter. If you're interested in learning how to do that kind of stuff, Crystal Basics has a whole chapter 2, Decoding Crystals, that walks you through this process of kind of figuring out how we can discover what the correlations are between a specific rock or mineral's composition, structure, and so on and so forth, how that relates to its energy. So if you ever find a book, or rather, if you find a crystal that's not in your crystal books, you can figure that out from chapter 2 in Crystal Basics.
Fantastic. My goodness, we've been recording for about 2 hours here. Nicholas, this has been such a fantastic episode. I know some people were like, Doug, we wanted to see you take down the new age crystal people. And I'm like, you know what? I can't do it. Because here's the thing. Crystals and stones have been a part of magic forever. They've been a part of the human experience forever. That the last 250 years, some people have, in a certain segment of the world, are like, nah, actually, they don't do anything. Can't prove it in a laboratory. The rest of that knowledge is garbage. It holds very little currency for me. So there are places to go here. And I'm so glad that we had Nicholas here to help us through it, because there is so much. There's rich veins to be discovered here, if you'll forgive another pun. But Nicholas, tell us what is going on at the Luminous Pearl. You have books. I mentioned the 7 archetypal stones. Oh man, I wonder if I can go through them. It's lapis lazuli, diamond, emerald. Oh man, amethyst is in there. Obsidian. Oh, I've got 2 more. What are the other 2? Quartz and
Emerald.
Did you say emerald? I think I did say emerald. Yeah.
Jade then.
Jade, that's it. That's Jade, the one. Yes. Fantastic book. I had a chance to read it before doing this interview. It is wonderful. You also have Crystal Basics, just released in March, I believe, of this year, 450. This is the pocket encyclopedia. I don't have the book. I had a chance to flip through it very, very cursorily and very quickly. The beginning chapters are really wonderful. And then when it gets to the nitty gritty, I've used that term already again. And you have you have healing properties, psychic properties for each, and another category for each listing.
Yeah, physical, psychological, spiritual quality for each one.
Perfect. And that is a wonderful guide as well. Are there any other books you'd like the people to know about, or do you want to expand on those? What do you got going for classes? Where can people find your stuff? Tell us. Just be shameless. Just tell us absolutely everything, because this has been one of the more fun episodes I've done, and not just fun, mind-blowing and expansive. And I really hope people enjoy this as much and enjoy what you had to say, because I want them to find your work. Tell them how.
Well, thank you. You asked for it, so you're going to get it.
Please.
So I do have 8 books in print, 3 more in progress, and then a whole bunch more planned. So although most of my books are about crystals, I've got a text on flower essences, flower essences from the witch's garden, plant spirits, and magical herbalism, which I think our occulty crowd here might appreciate.
Definitely.
I also have a textbook to the first and second degree of the practice of Reiki called Foundations of Reiki Ryoho, and more follow-ups to that planned. I teach a lot. I teach primarily online because that's the world we live in now, but I do have some in-person events. You'll see me at some upcoming festivals and other things. As time goes on, I'll be at Temple Fest in Massachusetts here in the States in late September. I'm headed back up to Massachusetts in October for some Reiki training and some crystal classes. I partner with the College of Psychic Studies for online curriculum periodically throughout the year. So I've got a great lineup of new classes that bridges the kind of old occultism with the new metaphysics and finds the common ground between them for topics like angelic crystals and talismanic magic.
Awesome.
Crystals for ancestral healing. I've got one for crystals for highly sensitive people. So I try to change up the curriculum constantly because I like variety and I don't want to repeat the same stuff. And I imagine that's true of others. But if anyone wants to find out more about me, the work that I do, where I'm going to be, when I'm going to be teaching, you can find me at theluminousppearl.com or at the Luminous Pearl on most social media. I do the most work on Instagram. I do weekly lives with no regular schedule.
You do large Q&As as well. I had a chance to watch. It was like an hour and a half. So that's something for people as well. So yeah, if you're on Instagram and you're not following Nicholas at the Luminous Pearl, please, it's awesome. And some of the pics of the crystals there, they're like, crystal envy over here. Is like they're beautiful. They're wonderful. So everybody, please head to Instagram and follow Nicholas. But also, your website is
theluminousppearl.com.
Perfect. And there is a link tree there as well on the Instagram account. I will have all of the things, including Nicholas's wonderful Patreon account. If you should want to support what Nicholas gets up to, that's a great place of doing so, as well as all of the other things that we talked about on the webpage, and including the show notes. All of those things are available at whatmagicisthis.com. Also, there you can find a link to my Instagram account, my Facebook account, as well as my Twitter account, or I think it's called X or something now. So, I don't know. I really don't know. Anyhow, all of those things, all of the good stuff is available at whatmagicisthis.com. Do you think that I'm doing something kind of cool here with the podcast and you'd like to show your support in some way? Well, there's a few places that you can do that. The very first place I'm going to tell you about is the best, and I do it every single episode. It is Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Find any one of the Patreon support me buttons there. Just click that. It'll take you right to it. Man, on my Patreon, I get up to so many things. I get up to as much stuff on my Patreon as I do for this regular podcast. And in some ways, I personally think that what I do on my Patreon is my favorite stuff. I just uploaded a video about how to create your own Ouija board, and it's not what you think. It's really incredible, really cool, fun, artistic Ouija board setup. Anyways, I think it's wonderful. There's videos there on other stuff. I have episodes about saints and gods and entities, and I take you through how to do Solomonic magic or get started on Solomonic magic and grimoires and books that I find interesting. It's just, if you love what I get up to at What Magic Is This on this podcast, you have to support me on Patreon. It is the best way of supporting me. It's only $7 a month. Everybody else is raising their prices. I'm keeping it at $7 a month because I know things are a little bit dicey out there as far as the economy is concerned. So $7, that's all I'm asking. It gets you basically a whole different show. So please come over and support me on Patreon. I'd really appreciate it. If you don't like the Patreon thing, I have PayPal. Click the PayPal buttons on my website. You can donate $5, $10. You can donate any amount. It is all appreciated. It just goes right back into supporting me on the podcast. I just had somebody recently throw me quite a lovely chunk of change, so I want to say thank you, Lisa, for doing that. You are the absolute best. I really appreciate your generosity. Everybody be like Lisa. She went above and beyond to support my show on PayPal. All of the money donated through PayPal goes right back into making this show happen. Things are expensive. This is the very first show that I've edited on software that I am trialing for my editing suite. And it's an interesting one. So if there's some weird noises in this one, it's merely because I'm trying some new editing software. The old stuff is not cutting mustard anymore. So anyways, again, podcasting is expensive. I want to do the best job that I can. And for that, that requires a lot of money. And so when you donate on PayPal, it goes right back into supporting what I do and keeping the fires on here at What Magic Is This headquarters. If you don't feel like doing the Patreon or the PayPal, there's also merch you can buy. Head to my website, whatmagicisthis.com. Find the merch button in the menu. And t-shirts, hoodies, notebooks, magnets, stickers. Just put a sticker on something recently because that's what you do with stickers. You put them on things and it looks great. I love all of my merchandise is the best and it's great. Some people have been buying some things recently, so I really appreciate it. I don't see a ton of money from that, but it is always awesome to see people wearing my stuff. I love it each and every time somebody uses anything. And somebody recently bought a notebook for their geomancy, and they were showing it off in the What Magic Is This Discord. It's awesome. I love that kind of stuff, and the notebooks are truly the best. I've got a lot of them. I am my best customer because that's just how it goes. Anyhow, I don't see a ton from the merchandise, but it is wonderful if you want to throw a few shekels and get yourself something cool to wear or to use. Yay, materialism, right? The place that I would love to see your support, though, would be the Patreon. Again, $7 a month. I would love to see you there and supporting me. But anyhow, all of the things that I have just talked about through this whole segment are available at whatmagicisthis.com. Please head there and check it out. Oh, man, you don't have to answer, but a book on scrying, is there a timetable for this book to be published, or is that something you can't?
Let's just say, I don't think this will get me in trouble. It's part of a larger body of work.
Okay.
So a foundation has to be laid first.
Got it. Love it. Perfect. A bedrock foundation has to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
There we go. Nicholas, this has been so much fun. I had a blast. I'm so happy I found your work, and I'm so happy I was able to get you on this show because this is one that I wanted to get right. And by that, I needed to have the perfect guest, and I found it. And we produced what I will say is a perfect episode. There's so many things to take on here, and I hope the listeners enjoyed it half as much as I did recording it. Nicholas, I really hope if I was to ask you to come back on the show at some point in the future, you'd be willing to do so because I've just had so much fun this morning, and I really hope the listeners enjoyed listening.
I had a great time. The pleasure would be mine to return. You name it, I'll be there.
Fantastic. Oh man, everybody get your hands into the dirt, get some stones in your hands to have a look at them because there's so many places to go. And this truly, stones, gems, rocks, it's all magical. It's been magic forever. It is magic. You can't say it's not. I'm just going to say that. You can't say it's not. So everybody, that's the show. Come on back to What Magic Is This. We'll talk about more of this wonderful, crystalline, prismatic, beautiful, gorgeous, sometimes valuable thing that we like to call magic and the occult. Until next time, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and of course, to stay luminous. Until next time, goodbye, everybody. Ta-ta.